Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about a woman whose story refused to die, literally. Imagine you're walking through an ancient church, where flickering candlelight casts shadows on statues, cracked and worn by time. Your footsteps echo through the cold stone, and you're certain you're alone, until you see her. Not a ghost, not exactly a corpse, but a woman, a queen, lying there in a slightly opened wooden coffin, her skin yellowed with age, her eyes seemingly half open, as if even death itself didn't dare to close her story. Centuries after her heart stopped beating, she was still being watched, whispered about, and even kissed. Yes, kissed, by none other than a legendary king, her own descendant, in a moment no one could quite explain. You think royal television dramas are dramatic? Wait until you hear the rest of tonight's story. Because this isn't just a tale about a secret marriage or a forbidden love. This is the story of a woman forgotten in life, violated in death, and then becoming the mother of an entire dynasty. Oh, and if you still think queens of the past lived like fairy tale princesses, well, sorry in advance. You wouldn't survive it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't hesitate to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Who knows? Maybe we're awake together in the same mysterious hour. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You know, if there were a sound to describe Catherine's childhood, it would probably be the hurried footsteps on cold stone tiles of a servant rushing to fetch a doctor for a king screaming because he thought he was made of glass. You didn't miss here. Catherine's father, King Charles VI of France, once believed that he was made of glass, and not in the modern Tumblr poetic "I'm fragile" kind of way. He truly believed that if anyone touched him, he would shatter into 100 pieces. At that time, you were just a little girl, born in a palace that seemed magnificent, but was actually full of sighs and averted gazes. Your mother, Queen Isabeau, was as cold as the Paris winter wind. Some historians even say she sold royal jewelry to side with whichever political faction benefited her. History is never 100% certain, but when the entire court whispered that she didn't care about her children, well, you get the idea. You grew up in a world where dinner was served on silver, but the whispers behind your back were colder than the dining knives. France was divided into two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, and you were like a small flag fluttering in the winds of politics. You were never taught how to rule, never prepared to become a heroine or a reformer. Your purpose in life, according to the diplomatic papers written at the time, was to be married off. Married to whom? And for what? Oh. The answer lay in a man with the surname Plantagenet, eyes gleaming like the edge of a sword, who had just crushed the French army at Agincourt, King Henry V of England. In the year 1420, under the Treaty of Troyes, a French princess were handed over like a marriage token to help ease the war. And ease here meant marry the man who had just defeated your country to make peace. Hi, I don't know about you, but if I were Catherine, I'd need a cup of tea immediately, with honey if available, and perhaps a therapist on the side. The marriage, according to records, happened quickly, far too quickly. You were 18. He was at the height of his glory. People described you as gentle, demure, and very suitable for childbearing. Yes, that was the historical compliment you received. You played your part well. You smiled before the crowds, followed your husband to England, and within a year you had given birth to little Henry, the boy who would later become Henry VI. But then just a few months later, Henry V died of dysentery in France, and you became a royal widow. At 21, you were a single mother whose child was the King of England. But you had no real power. Instead of being supported, you were watched. The English Parliament even passed a special law just for you. You were not allowed to remarry unless you had the consent of the Regency Council, that is, the very people controlling your own son. Imagine getting divorced but still having your ex control your Facebook password. Except instead of Facebook, this was your entire life and reputation. Historians still debate whether that law was meant to protect the throne or was actually a gilded cage to keep you in silence. Because, you see, if you remarried, your new husband could create a bloodline with a claim to your son's throne, and for a court already teeming with factions, that was like pouring oil on a fire. So you, the Queen, the King's mother, were moved into a small residence, withdrawn from court life, your days passing between silent walls and the watchful eyes of servants. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. You were not to be loved. You were not to marry. You were not to live freely as an ordinary human being. And then, in that silence, you met Owen Tudor. He was a Welshman, with a touch of noble blood, but no great title. Some say he was the keeper of your wardrobe. A simple, gentle man, and not someone meant to draw attention. Until you looked at him, and he looked back. They left no love letters, nor diaries, but somehow, rumours spread through the corridors that you had fallen in love, that you had borne children, that you, a woman considered dangerous simply because you were still young and had a womb, had dared to step outside the political cage and choose happiness for yourself. Well, if cameras had existed in the 15th century, this would have been the moment Netflix slowed down with a mournful soundtrack. You know, real love rarely happens between two crowns. It often begins where no one is looking in a dim hallway, in a glance held a moment too long, or in a cloak adjusted with more care than necessary. Owen Tudor was no prince. He had no land, no power, and it's not even clear if he was allowed to speak privately with you. But perhaps that's exactly what made him special. While everyone else saw you as a living political symbol, Owen Sol, Epison, no one knows exactly when the love between the two of you began. Perhaps it was when he placed his hand on your wrist to help tie the ribbon again. Perhaps it was when you were standing by the window, gazing toward distant France, and he, rather than bowing his head and quietly walking away, dared to stand beside you. Historians today still have not agreed on whether the two of you were truly married. Some vague records say there was a secret wedding, even a priest, but others argue that it was merely an unauthorized affair, taking place in the shadows, much like your life at the time. Either way, the outcome was undeniable. You had children with Owen. Not just one, but at least 4. Among them was a boy named Edmund Tudor, who would later marry Margaret Beaufort and give birth to a child named Henry. You see it now, don't you? A love that was not allowed quietly laid the first stone of an entire dynasty. A queen forgotten became the matriarch of the House of Tudor, home to names that would shake history, like Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. But in those days, love was not enough to protect you from scandal. When the court discovered the relationship, they did not respond with open rage. They did something worse. They quietly separated you from Owen, sending you to Bermondsey Abbey, a convent entirely removed from political life. On the surface, they said you needed rest and reflection, but everyone knew it was exile in disguise, a life of loneliness, without ceremony, without music, without the laughter of children. You fell ill not long after. Perhaps it was the lungs, perhaps the heart, or perhaps no one can live forever with a broken heart. At the age of 36, too young for a queen, too lonely for a mother, you died. No royal funeral, no trumpets or foreign envoys in attendance. You were buried at Westminster Abbey, but without a separate tomb, without a marble slab, without an inscription to remember your name, just a plain wooden coffin, roughly closed, left quietly in a dark corner. And do you know what the strange part was? That coffin was never sealed. Over time, air seeped in, dust settled, wind passed through the cracks, and your body, for reasons no one could understand, remained almost perfectly preserved. Hundreds of years later, when the abbey was being repaired, someone opened the coffin. And then the rumors began. Some said your skin gleamed with a golden hue like beeswax. Some said your face looked as though it wore a mask, your eyes not entirely closed. Some, even though no one ever confirmed it, claimed you still had the faint scent of old lavender. And then came the most chilling part of the story. A 17th century German travel writer named Paul Hentzner once recounted that during a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey, a very particular king walked past your coffin. It was Henry VIII. Yes, the very man who would split England from the Catholic Church, who would behead his own wives, who would shatter centuries of tradition paused before the mummified body of his great-grandmother. He bowed his head, then bent even lower and kissed your withered face. Sounds like low-grade horror fiction on YouTube at 3 in the morning, doesn't it? But that story, though never proven beyond doubt, was repeated in folk accounts for centuries. Some argue it was a gesture of reverence, others, a moment of madness, or perhaps a mix of guilt and twisted gratitude. Because without you, a woman forgotten, forbidden, isolated, there would have been no him. You see, history has always liked to hide women like you in the shadows, but it can never stop them from becoming the center of upheaval. After you passed away in silence, the story did not end. In truth, one could say your death was only the opening act for consequences neither the royal family nor the country was prepared for. Because you did not die alone. You left behind not just a half-open coffin in a dark corner, but a dangerous legacy. Children, not children by a king. Not children of a bloodline legitimized by royal decree, but children by a Welshman never approved by the throne. Edmund Tudor, Jasper Tudor, and your other children with Owen were living links in a chain of plots, never fully written into the history books. So, the moment you closed your eyes, they immediately seized Owen, the man who had once been a servant, once a lover. Once the father of your children was now thrown straight into Newgate prison. If you have never heard of Newgate, imagine this. A damp, foul place where, instead of having the right to call a lawyer, prisoners had the right to a bowl of thin gruel if they lived until the next morning. Owen's crime? Not treason. Not a plot to overthrow the court. But daring to love. Daring to touch a queen. Daring to cross a line carved in blood and rank. Perhaps if it happened today, it would be splashed across tabloids with the headline, "Forbidden Love Affair Rocks the British Royal Family." But in the 15th century, it meant the executioner's blade had already been sharpened. Luckily, Owen was not executed immediately. Perhaps there was still some mercy, or perhaps it was because he was not worth making into a martyr. Either way, he was released sometime later. But freedom did not mean safety, because you were no longer there to protect him. And the children you had together, especially Edmund, were now a threat to all of England. Picture this, a bloodline growing in the shadows. Not legitimate, but not to be underestimated. The grandchild of a French queen, a descendant of both the Valois and Plantagenet lines, but born from a forbidden love. Historians still debate whether the court truly intended to wipe out your descendants, or simply wanted them to live quietly, harmlessly. Either way, Edmund and Jasper grew up not in luxury but carrying a bloodline that could never be forgotten. The story took another turn. In the year 1461, when the Wars of the Roses broke out between the houses of Lancaster and York, your children, now grown men, were pulled into the political storm. Edmund Tudor, Your son married a young girl named Margaret Beaufort. And who was she? One of the few young women of pure royal blood, a descendant of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. And here's the strange part. Two bloodlines, one forbidden, one royal, joined. And the result? A child named Henry Tudor. Henry was your grandson, and he would overthrow the House of York, unite England, and become the first king of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII. But wait, back to Owen, when the Wars of the Roses erupted. He, now an old man, was drawn into a political uprising. This time, there was no forgiveness. Owen Tudor was captured once again, and in the year 1461, he was publicly executed. No pardon. No honor? From a man once loved by a queen, he died as an anonymous rebel. His head fell without a single trumpet to send him off. People forgot him, but no one forgot the consequences of that love. History has a strange habit. Those who are buried are often the ones who laid the foundations. You, Catherine, were forgotten, but your blood never slept. And now, it was your grandson, Henry Tudor, who stepped out of the shadows, carrying a surname that had once not even been considered legitimate. Henry was born into circumstances no one would have bet on. His father, Edmund Tudor, died young. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, gave birth to him at just 13 years old. And imagine this. At that age, giving birth in a time of civil war, when choosing the wrong side could see your entire family executed. In truth, bringing Henry into the world was already a miracle. The boy grew up in war, not the kind where you hear bedtime stories and fall asleep, but the kind where, in the morning you hear news of relatives being beheaded, and at night you flee a castle under siege. Because at that time, the Wars of the Roses were at their peak between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, two royal lines clashing like two raging storms. And caught in the middle was Henry. Though in theory Henry belonged to the Lancastrian side, because his father carried the Tudor blood, meaning he was not entirely legitimate, neither side fully trusted him. The result? Henry was sent into exile at a very young age. Imagine a future king living in hiding in France, without royal robes, without a court, holding on to only one thing for strength: your blood running through his veins. Here's a detail few know. During his exile, Henry lived in the region of Brittany. In the small houses of provincial French nobility, he was not educated in the great schools, but taught by local priests and Breton-speaking nursemaids. Some say that in his dreams, Henry saw a woman in an old French gown, standing beside an open coffin, beckoning him to return. And then, the fate arrived. In the year 1483, after a series of assassinations, betrayals, and political upheavals, the House of York, led by King Richard III, took the throne. But that throne was soaked in blood. The two princes, sons of King Edward IV, Richard's nephews, vanished mysteriously in the Tower of London. To this day, no one knows whether they were killed or hidden away. And so, the people's faith began to waver. Someone needed to appear, someone royal enough to claim the crown, but not so stained with blood as to be hated. And so, Henry Tudor returned. In the year 1485, he landed in England with a small but elite army, marching toward the heart of the country, and in a place with a name that sounded like a bakery Bosworth Field, he did the unthinkable. He defeated Richard III in battle. A king died on the battlefield. A new king, never born to be one, took the throne. History shifted. Henry became king under the title Henry VII. And the first thing he did was not to build castles or throw feasts. It was to marry Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, thus uniting the bloodlines of Lancaster and York, ending the civil war that had raged for more than 30 years. If you're someone who loves symbolism, picture this: a man born in fear, carrying the surname of a father once beheaded for loving a queen. now sitting on the throne, beginning a new dynasty. And you know, though no one wrote it openly, modern scholars believe Henry VII was deeply grateful to you, because if you hadn't dared to love Owen, there would be no Edmund. If there were no Edmund, there would be no Henry. And if there were no Henry, there would be no modern England. Historians still debate whether Henry VII ever officially restored your honour, Catherine, but they agree on one thing. From his reign onward, the name Tudor was no longer taboo. It was placed into the history books, engraved on coats of arms, sewn onto flags, and proclaimed in cathedrals. A surname once tied to prohibition became the emblem of a royal dynasty. After Henry VII took the throne, the atmosphere in the royal court seemed to change, not the watchful tension of civil war, but a guarded, cautious, almost obsessive focus on heirs. You see, Henry VII was not the glorious type of king. His grandson would later be. He was practical, shrewd, and always carried the sense of being an outsider who had only just earned his seat at the royal table. He ruled not to celebrate his victory, but to keep that victory from slipping into the hands of envious rivals. He immediately strengthened the Tudor bloodline, producing as many children as possible. And among them was a boy with bright eyes and a temper as hot as forged iron, Henry VIII. Yes, the king famous for 6 wives, 3 religions, 1 reformation, and a cold kiss on the mummified face of his great-grandmother in a church corner. But we'll get to that later. First, you should know that when Henry VIII grew up, he carried not just the crown, but an obsession with succession. From childhood, Henry was not the primary heir. His older brother Arthur was the crown prince. But Arthur died young, leaving behind a young and beautiful Spanish widow named Catherine of Aragon. And as you might guess, Henry VIII later married that widow, another Catherine, but her fate would be little better than yours. Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon lasted nearly 20 years, but produced no surviving sons, only a daughter Mary. Later, Mary I. Henry began to grow anxious, for in his eyes, a queen could not keep the throne secure. And then, a young woman appeared, Anne Boleyn, beautiful, intelligent, a little reckless, and most importantly, she was not Catherine. Henry fell deeply in love, but his wife was still alive, and the Roman Church did not permit divorce. So, the only solution was break with the Church entirely. And so, simply to marry another woman and father a son, Henry VIII severed all ties with the Vatican, founded the Church of England, and declared himself its head. A reformation began. Monasteries were destroyed, church lands seized, thousands of monks expelled from their places of worship. Blood was spilled, divisions deepened, but Henry happily signed the marriage papers for his new wife. It all sounds messy, doesn't it? But notice one strange detail that few point out. Everything Henry did reforms. Marriages, annulments, executions revolved around one thing: bloodline. He was willing to kill to produce a boy with perfect Tudor blood. He executed Anne Boleyn when she, too, gave birth only to a daughter Elizabeth. He married wife after wife Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr in an attempt to mould the future to his will. Sound familiar? Henry VIII's entire life was haunted by the fear of history repeating itself. He had once been the unexpected heir. His mother Elizabeth of York was a York descendant. His father Henry VII was a Lancaster with a strange surname. The Tudor dynasty would stand only if he produced a generation of heirs no one could question. And you know what? Modern historians believe that this deep insecurity originated from your story, Catherine. The forgotten grandmother, the woman once forbidden to remarry, simply because of bloodline. Which is why the strangest act in royal history, Henry VIII kissing your mummified face, no longer seems so hard to understand. Some scholars say it was reverence, Others believe he suffered from an ancestral obsession. But there are also those who whisper, it was a belated apology. Because without you, a woman exiled for loving the wrong man, Henry would not have existed. They often called her the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. It sounds grand, mysterious, and a little like a perfume advertisement. But in truth, behind that title was a life filled with hesitation, refusal, and a constant tug of war between love and power, very much like yours. Catherine. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, the second wife, executed for failing to bear a son. See the pattern? A mother deemed worthless, and a daughter cast out of the line of succession. Elizabeth grew up under suspicion, watched closely, confined, and at one point nearly executed for alleged political plots. But that girl with hair red like a smouldering flame not only survived, she rose. In the year 1558, Elizabeth officially became Queen of England after the death of her half-sister Mary I, who had burned hundreds of Protestants alive and made all of Europe shudder, calling her Bloody Mary. Elizabeth Young, bright, clever, ascended the throne under the skeptical gaze of the court. They asked, whom will she marry? Who will control the Queen? Can she rule without a king beside her? Elizabeth's answer, spoken through her entire life, was, I need no one. And my friend, I'm sure you're smiling now because those are the very words you were never allowed to say. You, Catherine, were forced to marry the man who defeated your homeland. You were forbidden to remarry while still young. You were treated as a political risk simply because you could bear children. Elizabeth, she saw your tragedy, her mother's tragedy, and the tragedies of countless royal women, and decided to lock her own heart before anyone else could. She refused every proposal, even from the most powerful men in Europe. At times, she kept political romances with French, Spanish, and Polish nobles, as though choosing business partners, not husbands. But in the end, she married no one. I've already married a husband, the Kingdom of England, she said, and that statement seemed like an indirect way of clearing your name, because you were forced to marry the man who broke your homeland, while Elizabeth, your descendant, claimed her own heart so no one could ever use it as a political pawn. Under Elizabeth, England entered a golden age. William Shakespeare wrote his immortal plays. The English navy defeated the Spanish Armada. Trade expanded to India and the Middle East. England, once a small island nation, became a budding empire, riding the waves of the Atlantic. But you know, after all that glory, Elizabeth lived and died alone. No husband, no children, no heir of her own blood. In her final years, she would often sit silently for hours, saying nothing, her face painted thick, her wig white with age, her once piercing eyes now distant. Some days, her servants said, she did not sleep, just stood before a mirror, staring at herself, as though searching for the answer to something lost. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the Tudor dynasty officially ended. The dynasty you, Catherine, had begun with a quiet love, a forbidden name, ended in solitude, by a queen who carried your blood, but refused to let history repeat itself. You see, the entire Tudor dynasty from Henry VII, Henry VIII to Elizabeth I, carried your invisible echoes. Some owed you gratitude, some stepped over your pain to move forward. But no one could deny, without you, there would be no them. Thank you for staying with me, and I wish you a gentle night. Now, we return to where we began, but this time not to end. Rather, to look straight at what history tried to forget and failed. Picture this with me. Westminster Abbey, the most sacred space in England, the resting place of kings, queens, poots, and heroes. Candlelight flickers across reliefs, worn smooth by centuries. The scent of old oak, the faint drift of incense in the air, and in a shadowed corner, far from the grand gaze. There you are, Catherine. No monument, no headstone, just an old wooden coffin, hastily nailed shut. Perhaps they thought you would rest in peace. But you did not. Your coffin, for some reason, was never sealed completely. Perhaps money was scarce at the time. Perhaps you were not considered royal enough to be buried as a true queen. Or perhaps history simply wasn't ready to close your story. Century passed. Westminster was repaired, restored, opened to visitors and clergy. And then they saw you. At first it was the workmen. They said, "There's a woman's body in there. Skin yellow like wax. Her face as if she hasn't closed her eyes." Ailu. Some claimed you had a faint scent, like lavender. Others said, "It looks like a Madame Tussauds wax figure." But sadder, and the story spread. No one spoke of it loudly. But everyone knew. There was a forgotten queen lying silently in a half-open coffin. Among the rulers of the realm, the tale grew stranger when a German scholar, Paul Hentzner, visited Westminster in the late 17th century. He wrote in his account that he had seen your mummy, and in a chilling but unforgettable passage, he told of this. When Henry VIII passed by, he stopped, bent down, and kissed that withered face. A kiss? Why? Some said it was respect for an ancestor. Some said it was the secret madness of a prideful king. And some, and I believe you would smile to hear this said, it was an apology. A silent way of saying, "Thank you for giving me life." That kiss did not bring you back, but it ensured your story would never die. As time went on, instead of letting you rest, people kept opening your coffin. Sometimes for church renovations, sometimes for scientific study, sometimes simply out of curiosity. You were touched, recorded, sketched, and discussed more as an object than as a person. No one spoke of your chaotic childhood. No one told of your life in exile after becoming a mother. No one wept to know you died in loneliness at Bermondsey Abbey. They only asked, "Is she still intact? Has the skin cracked yet? Did Henry VIII really kiss her?" You were no longer Catherine of Valois, Queen of England. You became a display, a curiosity, a story for tea parties or school tours. Historians argue over many things. Why was your coffin never sealed? Did Henry VIII really kiss you? Why did your body not decay? Did someone deliberately allow you to remain present like that? No one can answer. All that is known is that you, a woman, once forbidden to love, became the living witness to a forbidden love. And then, finally, someone said, "Enough. Idem." In the 18th century, your coffin was at last sealed and placed in a more discreet tomb within the abbey. No more visitors allowed to see you. No more hands to touch you. But it was too late. Because your image, half-open eyes, wax yellow skin, and the kiss of a guilty king had already become part of collective memory. You did not need a monument. You did not need a throne. You did not need a golden biography. Simply by living, loving, and enduring, you rewrote history without ever holding a pen. As the world entered the modern age, people began to look back at the old pages of history, not only through admiration for kings, but with compassion for those who stood outside the spotlight, those who were underwritten, miswritten, or unwritten. Heaven too. You, Catherine of Valois, were one of them. No blockbuster film bears your name. No grand statue stands before the palace. No commemorative day in school textbooks. But slowly, bit by bit, people began to speak your name again. In the 20th century, a group of female historians, while reviewing records of English queens overshadowed by time, paused unexpectedly at you. Not because of power, not because of achievement, but because you represented something rare, an ordinary woman trapped in the extraordinary machinery of politics, war, and gender prejudice. You did not fight with sword or shield. You fought by existing in the cold confines of the royal court, in the half-open corner of a tomb, in the forgetfulness of your own bloodline. Today, modern scholars have begun to call you by new titles. The forgotten mother of the Tudor dynasty. The first woman punished for her ability to bear children. A living emblem of the right to love, to live, and to choose. It sounds simple now, but in your time, it was a luxury. You could not choose the man you loved. You could not decide your marriage. You could not be free after your husband's death. Even your death itself was not left intact, and because of that, you have become a voice for countless other women, those pushed aside in history because they held no scepter, wore no armor, and gave no speeches. You did not need to shout. You simply stayed silent, and let that silence echo through the centuries. Your story now appears in podcasts, in women's history books, in conferences on medieval women's rights. The places where you were once passed over are now the places where people linger the longest. And do you know what the most beautiful thing is? Young women who read about you rarely say, "Oh, this queen was so pitiful." They say, "She was strong. I've one she loved." Even when the whole world said no. I've one, she is me. In another world. I've one, today. Your coffin has at last been sealed forever in Westminster Abbey, no longer ajar, no longer under watch, no more curious eyes, no more cold touches from strange fingers, no more kisses from descendants haunted by glory, only a late peace. But perhaps you never needed a grand ceremony. You only needed what you finally have, someone to listen, someone to understand that your blood was not only the root of a dynasty, but also a warning bell for future generations about the cost of power and of silence. You see, history may choose to honor the strong, but time chooses those who were never allowed to speak. To pass on the most important lessons, Catherine of Valois, you were not the one who built the empire. You were the one who allowed it to exist through your small, quiet, yet undeniable existence. And if anything remains alive after all this, it is the truth that you loved. You gave birth to a bloodline. And you, though buried, never truly vanished. But you know what? No story truly ends when it still lives in the minds of others. And tonight, you and I will go on together, but this time, into the journey of memory, legacy, and what remains after 600 years of upheaval, a new chapter, where we not only tell your story, but trace the ripples of your life in the modern world. Something strange happens in the libraries of London, Oxford, and even Paris, whenever there is a new research project on forgotten medieval queens. Your name, Catherine, appears unexpectedly, not because you left behind many letters, not because you had a treasure trove of preserved possessions, but simply because there is something about you people cannot overlook. One of those things is irony. You were the daughter of a king called the Madman, yet you gave birth to a bloodline that drove England mad. You were the woman forbidden to love, yet that love rewrote the fate of all Europe. You were forgotten in life, violated in death, yet remembered longer than those who ordered the bans against you. Perhaps, if there is one profound lesson in your story, it is this: silence is not disappearance, and losing power does not mean losing influence. Today, in history courses at Cambridge or Yale, you are mentioned as an example of female soft power in the feudal age. It sounds academic, doesn't it? But in truth, they are speaking about you, the woman who changed history simply by giving birth to a child. You didn't need to go to the battlefield. You didn't need to speak before a council. You only needed not to give up your heart. And strangely, it is because you lived so quietly that your influence has spread farther than those who were loud. There was once an exhibition at the Women's History Museum in London that dedicated a small corner to you, just a wooden plaque, a replica of a ring said to be yours. and a short line. She was silenced. Yet she speaks still. Some visitors passed by, but there were others, especially women who lingered longer. A young woman wrote in the guest book beside it, "Thank you for loving, when the whole world forbade you to." And another wrote, "I am living as you once did, controlled, judged, but I will not be silent." Do you see? Catherine, even though you did not live to witness our time, we are living with the echoes of yours. And in truth, what you endured is not just history, it is a reality that repeats. When a woman is scolded for loving someone deemed unworthy, when a widow is controlled in her property, her future, and even her right to bear children, when a young mother is forbidden to remarry for fear she might break the system, when a woman is silenced because her very existence is inconvenient, all of these things, Catherine, still exist. Only now. They can be spoken of. They have social media, hashtags, playwrights, researchers, and artists retelling your story in light, not in darkness anymore. And there's something else. Recently, a group of young artists in England created a project called The Forgotten Queens, where they reimagined the portraits of queens who were never given statues. One of the central paintings was of you, Catherine of Valois, but not as you lay in a half-open coffin, not as you were kissed in silence, but as you stood in the center of the room, wearing a purple velvet gown, one hand holding a small book, the other holding the hand of a man with no armor, no crown Owen Tuther, both of you looking forward, as if stepping together into a new century, one where love no longer needed permission. They painted you as you should be seen, not a mummy, not an exhibit, but a mother, a lawber, a woman with a story that never truly ended. Tonight, you and I will play a gentle game called What If? Let's imagine together. No time machine needed. Just one single change in history. Catherine of Valois is allowed to remarry legally. Background: in the year 1422, King Henry V died. Catherine, only 21, became a widow. In reality, the English Parliament then passed a law forbidding her to remarry without the permission of the Regency Council, meaning of her own newborn son. But now imagine, that law never existed. Catherine is allowed to live like any other widow. The right to choose another partner, the right to remarry without supervision, the right to raise her children without being watched at every step. What would happen? Catherine and Owen, from the shadows into the light. No more secrecy, no more rumors, no more being called a criminal for love. Catherine marries Owen Tudor in a small but lawful ceremony, with a priest, vows, and the royal seal stamped into the marriage register. And do you know the miracle? Their children, Edmund and Jasper, would be the legitimate sons of a remarried queen. That means no one could call them half-royal or a threat to succession. They would grow up as true nobles, with a clear place in the court, educated as gentlemen rather than as the hidden offspring of a forbidden romance. And Owen, instead of being thrown into Newgate prison, he would become a respected gentleman, granted a title for marrying the former queen. Who knows? Perhaps he would be made Earl of Pembroke, or a Knight of the Body. Henry VI, a child raised between two worlds, grows up with love. In reality, Catherine's firstborn Henry VI was immediately handed over to the Regency Council and separated from his mother from infancy. But if Catherine were free, she could have raised him herself alongside the children of her new marriage. That would have made Henry VI a child with a family, with emotions, with kinship, instead of a fragile young king easily manipulated. And you know, historians believe Henry VI became a weak ruler, prone to mental breakdowns, partly because he lacked maternal care as a child. If Catherine had been allowed to be a true mother, perhaps the Wars of the Roses would not have erupted so violently. The Tudors are no longer a tainted bloodline. In reality, the Tudors were born from a love seen as wrongful, so the family carried the shadow of illegitimacy, inferiority, and uncertain claim. But if Catherine and Owen had married openly and legally from the start, then Edmund and Jasper Tudor would have official, lawful status. Henry VII, their grandson, would not have needed to marry Elizabeth of York to legitimize himself. The Tudor dynasty would have begun properly, without suspicion over its origins. Imagine it. England might have avoided 30 years of civil war, with just one single change, granting Catherine the right to love. Catherine herself would become the pioneer of a new idea about widows having the right to remarry. In the Middle Ages, noble widows were often seen as political assets still in use, meaning they could not love anyone else without permission. But if Catherine, a French queen, had openly remarried a man of Welsh origin, she would have been the first woman to break that unspoken rule. And who knows, after her, other noble ladies might have begun to demand, "I have the right to choose. I am not the ghost of my late husband. I am a person, not an extension of the throne." Women's history would have taken a different turn at least 400 years earlier. Catherine's death and her burial would be entirely different. Remember, in reality, Catherine died in loneliness at Bermondsey Abbey, without a funeral, without honour, without recognition. But if she had been the lawful wife of a gentleman and the mother of children recognised by the court, then her death would have been marked by a solemn funeral, would have included a private tomb with an inscription, a name, and full record. And certainly, there would have been no opening of her coffin for 200 years. In summary, if Catherine had been allowed to remarry legally, she would have lived a more complete life. Her children would not have been considered illegitimate. Henry VI might have become a stronger king. Henry VII would not have been forced to prove the Tudor bloodline. England might have avoided war, and the history of women's rights could have turned a corner much earlier. All it would have taken was a signature, a permission, a single moment of not controlling love. So now we will paint an alternate world where Catherine was neither forbidden nor forgotten, but lived as a human being, not a pawn. This is not just a game of historical imagination. This is a symphony of delayed justice, where you see all that could have happened if someone, on that day, had simply said, "Let her live her own life." What if? The Countess Tudor. Imagine you are Catherine in the year 1425. You, a 24-year-old widow, living in a small but warm estate, not far from London. No longer confined, no longer under watchful eyes, no longer bound by a law that polices your womb and your heart. You have a husband, Owen Tudor, a man who is not a king, who owns no vast lands, but knows how to make you laugh after nights haunted by the war. In the morning, you take young Henry, the king's son, by the hand for a walk in the garden. The boy asks you, "Mother, will I still be able to be king and live near you?" You smile, kiss his forehead, and do not answer, because you know that one day he will be crowned. But today, he is still your son, not a national symbol. In the afternoon, you tend to Edmund and Jasper, your children, with Owen. They carry your eyes, your blood, but they are not hidden away as something shameful. The court addresses you by a new title, Lady Catherine Tudor, Countess of Pembroke. An esteemed rank, granted by Parliament as recognition for your lawful remarriage and a life no longer strangled by politics. Henry VI grows up differently. Raised by his mother in his early years, Henry VI develops emotional stability, not locked in the tower, not raised by the book. He knows what love is because his mother often tells him about his father. Henry V, not just as a warrior, but as a man who once held her in his final moments. Henry VI grows up with a deep sense of peace, but without the weakness of reality. because beside him is a real family, not just regents. When the time comes for him to take the throne, he is not a puppet. He is not isolated. And when war threatens, he knows how to negotiate before drawing his sword. The Tudors from love to a legitimate power with a legal marriage, Edmund Tudor and Jasper Tudor become nobles from childhood. Edmund is granted the title Earl of Richmond at the age of 10. Jasper becomes a Knight of the Garter, forming bonds with other noble heirs. No one calls them illegitimate anymore. No more need to legitimize through marriage with the House of York. When Henry VII is born your grandson, he grows up as a true prince, without shame over his origins. And when the time comes to overthrow Richard III at Bosworth Field, Henry takes the throne with full legitimacy, without marrying Elizabeth of York to secure his claim. The result? No Lancaster-York union. No Elizabeth I, but possibly another queen, succeeding from a fully legitimate Tudor line. No break with the Roman Church, because Henry VIII would not be obsessed with bloodline to the point of marrying 6 wives. You see, just one small change allowing you to remarry legally would shift the political and religious map of Europe by several degrees. Catherine lives to old age, and witnesses an empire grow from her blood. Imagine you live until the year 1470, 69 years old. Older than most women of your time. You sit in a peaceful country estate by the Thames. Outside, red roses bloom the flower of the House of Lancaster. You write letters to Henry VI, now grown and reigning. You welcome Edmund back to visit with his son Henry VII, a boy whose brown eyes look uncannily like yours. People begin to call you the Mother of the New England. How a title of respect, but also of simplicity. When you die, all 3 of your sons attend your funeral. Your burial is without mummification, without a half-open coffin, without tourists peering in. It is a true funeral. Church bells, funeral verses, a headstone with a simple but immortal inscription. Here lies Catherine of Valois, who loved and was not sorry for it. So they go on. At this point, our Catherine is no longer a marginal figure. She has lived, loved, remarried legally, and has seen her blood flow through 3 generations, from war to peace, from obscurity to glory. Now, let us step into the autumn of her life. A woman once forbidden, now a living witness to the transformation of an empire. A woman who did not rule with a crown, but with memory. A queen no longer called a dangerous widow, but Lady Catherine, the founder of the New England. The golden autumn of a once-hidden life. Imagine the year is 1465. You are 64, a remarkable age for a medieval woman. No more censored letters. No more cold palace corridors. No more scrutinizing glances from male guardians. You live in an estate in Shropshire, where the soil is red. The maples are old, and white doves follow the seasons. Far in the distance, you hear the church bells strike the hour, a sound that once made you shrink when you were the French bride, forced to leave your homeland. Now, it is a steady whisper. You have done it. Owen, your husband is old now, but still patient by your side every day. His silver hair often blows in the wind, and whenever it does, he mutters, "I used to comb it more neatly for you back then." End of quote. You laugh the kind of laugh once forbidden in the very palace you once inhabited. A mother writes her memoir not to publish, but so her descendants know she existed. In the attic room, with an old wooden desk and an oil lamp, you begin to write, not for the court, not to leave a political legacy, but to tell everything you were never allowed to say. You write for Henry VI, your eldest son, so he knows his mother never abandoned him. She was forced away. You write for Edmund, your firstborn, with Owen, so he knows he is not the child of a wrongful love, as people say, but the child of a marriage blessed by patience. You write for the women to come, those forced into marriage for diplomacy, those stripped of their children simply because they are women. those condemned simply because their hearts did not fit neatly into the royal family tree. And then, you place the memoir into a small wooden chest. Lock it, and tell Owen, if one day our granddaughter becomes queen, let her read this. And for a world changes, and finally speaks your name in full. In 1485, you have passed. But that year, Henry Tudor, your grandson, defeats Richard III and becomes Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. And unlike real history, where he carried the burden of origin, striving to wash clean his bloodline, marrying Elizabeth of York to legitimize it in this timeline, he does not need to, because he is the legitimate son of Edmund Tudor, the son of a former queen who was allowed to live fully with the love of her life. Henry VII not only takes the throne by right, but also carries out his grandmother's wish to restore the name Catherine in the royal records, where it once read, widowed queen. It now says, Lady Catherine Tudor, Queen Dowager and Countess of Pembroke. Your tomb in Westminster Abbey is reopened not for display, but to build a worthy monument. Upon it is engraved Henry's own words, to the woman whose love birthed a line of kings. She was never forgotten, not even for a day. And in the future, people begin to dream of you, like a quiet lamp lighting history. In folklore, whenever a young queen ascends the throne, it is said that a woman in purple velvet will appear in her dreams. Place her hand on her shoulder. Say nothing, only smile. They call her the first mother of the New England. Not because she played politics, not because she wielded a sword, but because she dared to love when everything around her told her to be afraid.